Good afternoon, everyone. We are now live on Patient Advocates Transforming Healthcare, also known as PATH, Tuesday Table Talk. I'd like to welcome our audience that's listening in live and thank you to those joining us today. Our topic today is the role of patient partners in research and equity in research. And I'm really excited to have my guest here today, Ms. Kimberly Richardson, a patient advocate and an ovarian cancer advocate and survivor, as well as someone who's really been engaged in clinical research and patient-centered outcomes research. And I couldn't think of anyone better to have this conversation with today as we really talk and dig a little bit deeper in what does patient-partnered research really mean? And how do we really equitably bring everyone to the table for these very important conversations? I was just sharing with Kimberly right before we got onto our YouTube Tuesday Table Talk today, some of the quotes that have come out yesterday regarding the COVID vaccine, particularly from the Pfizer CEO, who was sharing that they're hopeful that something may be available by the end of October. Yet I looked later in some of his quotes during his I guess his pressers yesterday, where he specifically called out they were thankful for the many volunteers they've had for these vaccine trials. However, they were still looking to expand that research and those trials to vulnerable populations. And I thought that was really an interesting statement to make, given that we're supposed to be that much closer to a vaccine, yet it doesn't seem that we've really engaged many communities, including those most affected disproportionately by COVID-19 in this. And I think that speaks to some of our discussion today. And so I'm really excited to welcome Kimberly to our show today. For those of you joining us on YouTube, you always can, if you are signed into YouTube, throw out your questions and we will be happy to get to them as much as we can during the next 30 minutes. If we can't get to them, we are happy to follow up with you and connect you with Kimberly, who would be more than happy to have further conversations. So Kimberly, so many places we can begin today, but what I'd like to first have you share is just a little bit about some of the work you've been doing and what you see now given the current situation with obviously with COVID-19 and how it's impacted perhaps patient partner research, as well as the issues that really were always there around equity in research even prior to COVID, and maybe just give us a little bit of a high level overview of what you've seen and we'll maybe just take it from there.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, Hala. I think I'll start from giving people a sense of what I am and who I am to patient advocacy. As a 7-year ovarian cancer survivor, if you will, mine is a very rare form. And so I come to patient advocacy at the beginning of this diagnosis, trying to understand a little bit more about this particular subtype of ovarian cancer, not getting the information that I needed initially from my oncologist and not finding it on the internet. So I came to disparities head on with my diagnosis. And so then you couple that with how I went through my treatment with my and communicating with my uh, uh, former oncologist. And so you're layering on top of a rare form of ovarian cancer, the inability to really talk through and create a shared decision-making process. And then you have to couple in that I'm African-American, and then those data points are just not present on the internet as it relates to African-American women with rare gynecological. So I'm loaded down with all the disparities, right? And so that's one of the reasons that drives me toward advocacy. So I come to it from all those different experiences. What am I looking for as a cancer patient? Well, I was initially looking for a shared decision process. I didn't get that personally. So in advocacy, I come to the table looking for ways for patients to be heard, and if there are meaningful partnerships in relationship to cancer research. Again, I'm looking at disparities in terms of mortality rates and diagnostic rates in relationship to women across all of the gynecological cancers. What's happening with women of color in relationship to uterine cancer or cervical cancer, some of the cancers that actually do have diagnostics, and we don't need to necessarily still see these high levels of mortality rates. And so then you couple all of that, fast forward into this COVID-19 situation. And I'm thrust into that personally as well, because my daughter is an essential worker, right? And so, yes, I'm 7 years out from a diagnosis, but am I a part of those vulnerable populations that, the Pfizer CEO was speaking about? When you give us those terms, it makes you wonder how well, when we first started to hear more about COVID in February, March, as we start to get those announcements about the higher numbers of African Americans that were dying from COVID, that we were hearing through social media outlets who were being treated medically inside of hospitals, encouraged not to come in if you had symptoms. All those things were going back and forth in the African American community, right? People were, shining the light on us. And less than a week later, here come the protests from non-Black people. We want to say white, that's fine with me, but the protests about they demand to go back to work. And knowing that this is what we are experiencing, we're experiencing this high level of mortality rate regarding COVID. I have an essential worker that's coming in and out of my home, dealing with the public. On my TV, I'm seeing people basically saying, I want to go back to work. It's not affecting me, it's affecting them. And then as an advocate, I'm in social media groups, and I'm hearing about antibody testing and serological testing going on at some of the higher end institutions, and sitting here waiting to see when is this going to start to trickle down to policymakers, that there's outreach strategies connecting these tests to folks on the ground, to safety net hospitals. When are the antibody tests going to start happening in my community? How are we going to start saving more Black people based on what we know? And then not to see that happen. And then we jump straight to the vaccines. And once again, we are reintroducing that narrative of, oh, African Americans may not participate in taking this vaccine because, they really don't trust when it comes to clinical trials because of Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee experiment. We're already building up the excuse. And I'm sitting back in April saying, where was the outreach strategy to get us involved when we were coming in for testing, when we were being treated in these safety net hospitals? Did you just give me back my belongings and let me walk out the door? When were you getting my antibodies to help the next Black person that was going to walk in those doors and those safety net hospitals? I didn't see that connection. I didn't see any connections between the person who was actually tested, affected, and then the use of their antibodies on any of these upcoming vaccines that are coming out. So guess what, people? When Black folks tell you, no, I don't think I'm going to do this vaccine this first time around, it's intuitively because of all the things we experienced between April and August. What we saw, how we saw people respond to us, how we saw people respond to the number of our deaths, how we saw people, and people meaning healthcare providers to policymakers, So big pharma, they still haven't found a way to get into the neighborhood with the outreach strategy. When we were, it was almost as if we were behind the times. When it was time to think more about the antibody test, people were trying to make sure, look, we made sure everybody in the community now can do a COVID test. Well, that's nice to be able to get a swab. Now that all the news is coming about all the people that are asymptomatic, now that all the narrative is changing from mask, don't wear a mask, wear gloves, don't wear gloves, sanitize your hands, wash your hands to the alphabet. It was everything all at once, but we were again sloppy seconds. The sloppiest seconds as it related to how were we caring for African American people once that data hit the news.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's what I'm constantly thinking about, disparities in that framework.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up so many important points that I want to take some time to unpack. And God knows, I wish we had a whole day to go over these things, because I know we could talk about it for days.
I know we can.
So I guess, my question is, I think there's a day of reckoning on so many levels for so many different things right now. I think we've gotten to a tipping point in so many respects. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think, as someone who is very deeply and passionately involved in patient family caregiver engagement work, I have seen that work has taken some steps backwards. And that's not to say we were in a great place to begin with. Certainly not when it comes to equity or the discussion around equity and diversity and inclusion. We know that the narrative in patient family engagement has not reflected an equitable voice at the table. So, as we look at research, especially now, and we're talking about a vaccine that possibly could be ready at the end of October, how do we develop these partnerships? And more importantly, how do we really say, you can't wait? You can't just look at something for what it is today and not look about what's ahead or what will happen tomorrow. And I think you kind of alluded to that when you said, the antibody testing and their serologic testing, why wasn't that being done in conjunction with treating patients for COVID-19? So as someone who's heavily involved in patient partner research, what do you see as next steps? How do we get to that point where the research community understands that it can't be just about now, it has to be about what's ahead? And it also can't be that we keep saying or making many different reasons why we have not engaged other communities. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
Well, generally speaking, I think that, these types of clinical trials or the research has always been promoted to be homogeneous, and that's just the truth of the matter. I mean, you look at the data, there are not, number one, there are not large numbers of people volunteering for clinical trials as it is. Then you disaggregate that in terms of race, and African Americans are not participating that at high rates. But it's not like to me, it's semantics when we say volunteer. That suggests that I knew about it and I volunteered. When we look at the numbers and the percentage rates of African Americans participating in clinical trials, it's sort of been designed by nature. They've always been homogeneous. And so nobody said, there was no mandate, make these trials as diverse as you can get them. It was no, get the trial done. And so this is what these investigators do. And it doesn't matter, what ethnicity or nationality that they were. They're hired to do the job, and the job was to get the accrual, get the enrollment, get the numbers we need so we can get started. And there was no mandate that said, hey, this does not start until it's 40% people of color. It's not even a mandate. So, I mean, when we start talking about where do we get started, that's where we get started. That's where we say to pharma and to all folks doing on all sites, that if that has to be a part of the IRB process in order to get approved, you have to demonstrate a certain number of folks in terms of diversity. You won't get this grant, you be able to move forward. And then and money has a way of making people go, oh, did you want me to put more people of color in this study? Okay. But when there's nothing in the language anywhere, there are no requirements, there's no culture within any of these clinical trial sites where heterogeneity needs to be a part of the process, then it just won't be. I mean, I think that's the most pleasant place where we can start. Start with the actual written word, right? And then reward those scientists and researchers who are putting their research where their mouth is, so to speak. So that's the way I see it. If you have to come along. COVID has changed the way we look at this thing. George Floyd in the middle of COVID, it's just, it took the covers off. It is now the time in this world where we can all say, we know that you know that we know. And it's a wrap. It's nothing else to talk about or discuss. It's not about, going through all this diversity and inclusion stuff. It clearly is, this is how it is. This is how it needs to be changed. And these are the steps we need to take to do that. Instead, what we want to do is buffer, right? Explain to me why there's this mistrust amongst African Americans and clinical trials. And then we have a long panel discussion about, the history of Henrietta Lacks and the history of the Tuskegee experiment. And we spend time on that. But we know that you know. So we're spending an inordinate amount of time on white privilege and systemic racism and trying to get the majority to understand that piece so that we can move forward. And I think that's the energy zapper. I think that we all know. And now it's time to correct the problem. And it's the same folks who have built the system that are going to be a large part of creating the diversity and inclusion. Right? And it's not about what we're finding right now, where everybody's running out with these statements and, saying that they're a part of diversity and inclusion. And then, like we said, how do we measure that? And 6 months from now, how do we measure that you've in fact changed anything? Well, that's the hurry up and wait scenario that we've seen as people of color. We've seen this all the time. Put it in words, make bold statements, and then there are no results behind it. So 6 months from now, we'll go see, well, we hired an officer, we hired a consultant for diversity and inclusion. And that's that hurry it up process. Let's get this back under the covers. Let's not keep it exposed until we heal it. Let's keep slapping Band-Aids on it, kind of a approach. And so from one perspective, that is ending the conversation. We got the diversity and inclusion officer. And from people of color, it's the beginning of the conversation because we weren't having it before. And that's what COVID and Zoom and social media has allowed us to do. It's in Twitter, having these rich conversations about this is what I have experienced in the healthcare field. This is what I have experienced as a scientist, as an African-American. I see it all across Twitter. People are now having these discussions, and we really need to make sure that people understand this is the beginning of the conversation, but it's not the beginning of a history lesson. It's the beginning of solutions and implementation and planning and strategizing. That's what's important at this juncture. What I am not interested in as an advocate is a history lesson, because I've been living as an African-American a long time. So I don't need to sit on panels or in discussions where we're getting folks up to speed, because we already know that you know that we know.
Yeah, very well put. Now that we know that you know that you know, how do we take that and say to ourselves, enough is enough, and now it's really time for that solutions-based orientation of action and advocacy work that has to happen? Because I know you and I, just even last night on a podcast we were on, talked a little bit about this. And, you know, as you and I being, you know, patient, family, engagement, advocate leaders, our community of engagement leaders is broad and large, and we certainly get pulled in a lot of different directions, particularly now. And we had a very open discussion about, you know, that level of kind of activism that has to happen. That just the role of being an advocate per se is not enough. And it speaks to all the things you just mentioned, because that all takes a role of activism, right? Yes. And so in these last few minutes, I kind of want to spend some time on how do we ignite that activism within our, you know, community of advocates, whether they're focused on research, measurement, patient experience, you know, quality improvement, patient safety, whatever it may be. How do we ignite that activism to really get to those solutions that we talk about? Because we know the evidence is there. We know the data is there. We know what we need to do, and yet we still don't do it. And to me, that is where I see that activism role. And in addition to some of also what you spoke to is, you know, having it mandated. And the only way we can have it mandated is funders stepping up and saying, you must do this or you do not get this.
Exactly.
And, you know, in some of my work that I've done, this has been, you know, a topic that's come up, the role of funders and the role of academic institutions. And we really need leadership there to say, this funding and this research will not happen unless like the examples you give. And so how do we ignite that activism? How do we ignite it within our own community? And how do we ignite it with those whom we partner with?
You know what? I think about this all the time, and I'm thinking right off the top of my head, just a sociology 101 type experiment. You go on your own Facebook page, people that you have accepted as friends that you didn't really personally know. You had something in common. Maybe you were a runner, maybe you're a cancer patient, right? And as our world began to explode around COVID-19 and the George Floyd situation and all of the racial tensions that were happening, all you need to do is scroll through your own social media to see how diverse people think about any given situation that's happening around systemic racism and the COVID-19 situation, right? And so if you look at all of those, you scroll through all those posts and you take note of your own reaction. Oh my God, I had no idea she thought like that. Oh my God, they're actually saying this out loud, right? And take that and multiply that on a bigger scale. Now we're not just looking in our Facebook group, but now we realize that that post may have come from the CEO of an organization that is creating a new RFP around disparities in COVID-19. It just becomes just that common. It's what you think is how you apply everything. Everything is about politics. So whatever you're thinking, whatever your opinions are, you apply that to your work. And so this is the reason why when we start looking at these RFPs, that we're not going to see those mandates that you and I are talking about, because we're not in that power structure to create the new RFP. So once again, what we're going to see in RFPs are research the problem. And people are going to, oh yeah, I could talk about the problem. But the RFP is not asking you to create a solution. It's not even asking you really to create an implementation plan. I think just the other day, something on my social media said, Harvard just released a study showing why more Black men are in jail. 4-year study that they got funded for. Now I ain't hating on Harvard, but the average brother on the corner could tell you why there are more Black men in jail. It's like, seriously. Now, if you want to even get a little deeper about it and more academic, yeah, we could probably take this back to the war on crime and blah, 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 and how every president did what they did, decisions that they made about the prison system. And ergo, that is the reason why there are more Black men in prison. But what at the end of the day does the data do toward a solution? And how do you tell the brother on the corner that he already intuitively knew that and didn't need, that 4-year grant could have possibly bettered his lifestyle if you just wanted somebody to research the problem? So this is where we're always going to be. We want the mandate, but we don't have the progressive folks in the position to make the decision about how we could get to those solutions. We're right back to the comment about vulnerable populations. Where did he hear that terminology? And find and thought that was an acceptable, politically correct thing to say, because he's probably seen that a lot in the RFP responses, to some of his grants. He's heard researchers give things those terms, and then in those terms, then in turn create the narrative. So guess what? We're going to start getting a lot of studies that say, Oh, the reason why African Americans don't participate in clinical trials. Ta-da! Mistrust back from the Tuskegee experiment. And then we're gonna be sitting here going, really? Did you really need to get $250,000 to do that? We are not focused in on solutions. We're focused in on research for the sake of research. If the RFPs are not set up correctly, we won't get we won't get strategies. We won't. It's inherent in the process that what we're going to do first is let's be 100% clear that we have researched the problem. And inherently, we already know, all of us. When you scroll through your Facebook page, you're very clear that all of us know what the problem is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we will definitely have, you and I and many others, more conversations over the coming months. But unfortunately, we've gotten to the end of our time today. I do want to thank Kimberly so much for joining us. I think, the thing I want to take away particularly and highlight from this conversation is we really have to start pushing outside of the box and stop researching problems and research solutions. And in researching those solutions, we must engage all communities, particularly the communities that your research is about. And I say that with a bit of disdain because as someone who also works in this field, it continues to really perplex me that we continue not to understand a very basic concept of having to partner with those whom are most affected by whatever we are working towards researching, and especially when we start hopefully working towards solutions. So to our audience today, on behalf of Patient Advocates Transforming Healthcare, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us. Catch us next week on our Tuesday Table Talk, always here on our PATH YouTube channel at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Our topic next week, Kimberly, is actually about building trust. Haha. But we will definitely take some of what we learned today to frame a little bit more about that conversation. I think, in terms of trust, it really is about, I don't know where I can trust if I don't believe you're working towards a solution. I think that's really the key. And that's certainly not to say, obviously, there's quite a bit of history that goes along with that. However, I think the mistake we continue to make is the fact that we don't engage and partner with those whose voices need to be at the table. So Kimberly, if you could just stay on a couple seconds as we close out our YouTube stream. And thank you all once again for joining us today. Have a great week. Thanks again.